The church bell screamed once, just once, before the rope snapped and the entire tower shuddered like a wounded animal, sending bronze and timber crashing into the mud of Willow Crossing's main street. People froze mid-step. Horses reared, eyes white. Steam rose from the river fog and tangled with the dust, wrapping the town in a damp, choking silence that felt heavier than any sound. The bell had ever made. At the center of it all stood Maeve Calder. She was 30 years old. Tall and solidly built, her dark hair braided tight and streaked with mist. Her coat, thick wool, patched at the elbows, hung open, revealing a linen shirt stained with sap and river grit. Her hands still gripped the rope, knuckles raw, breath steady. She did not flinch. She did not look at the fallen bell. She looked at the men. The bell lay on its side like a dead beast, split open where it had struck the cobbles. Its mouth gaped uselessly toward the gray sky, the last echo of its voice fading into the pine-covered hills that hemmed the town in on three sides. Willow Crossing had hauled that bell over 200 miles of mud and stone 2 decades ago, and men still spoke of it with reverence, how it marked weddings, warnings, funerals, and shame. Maeve loosened the rope from her hands and let it fall. "I warned you," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. "I told you what would happen if you rang it again." No one answered. This was not a desert town where dust swallowed sound and the sun ruled all judgment. Willow Crossing lived under fog and rain, under the constant breath of the Blackwater River that ran thick and cold along its eastern edge. Pines crowded close, their roots tearing at foundations, their shadows swallowing porches. Wood rotted fast here. Secrets faster. Men shifted uneasily. Hats were removed, then put back on. Someone coughed. Sheriff Alden Pike stepped forward at last, boots sinking into the mud with a wet sound. His hair had gone gray long before his time, and his eyes held the weary look of a man who had spent his life standing between right and ruin and failing at both. "Maeve," he said quietly, as though volume itself might shatter something fragile, "you've crossed a line." She met his gaze without blinking. "You drew it first." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maeve Calder had been a problem since the day she arrived, 7 years ago. She came upriver on a freight barge with a mule, a crate of tools, and a folded deed no one wanted. The old ice house squatted by the riverbank like a half-buried memory, stone walls slick with moss, doors warped from floodwater. A man had drawn there once, crushed beneath a shifting block of winter ice. Folks said the river claimed what was hers. Maeve bought it anyway. She worked alone. She learned the river's moods, its dangerous bends, its silent warnings. Every winter she cut ice thicker than a man's arm, stacked it beneath sawdust and stone, and sold it through the heat of summer when meat spoiled and tempers flared. She kept careful ledgers. She paid no one bribes. She owed no one favors. That, more than anything, was her sin, but what turned irritation into obsession, what made men lean close in taverns and grin too wide, was what she refused to do. Maeve refused to bow. When men teased her about her strength, her solitude, her lack of husband, she didn't smile or snap back. She simply stared at them as if they were whether temporary, inconvenient, beneath notice. She didn't laugh at their jokes or soften her tone to soothe their pride. Silence, they discovered, was unbearable. So they made a sport of her. It started small. Comments shouted from porches. Coins tossed at her feet in mock help. Then came the bell. The first time it rang was the night. Maeve declined 3 marriage proposals in a single week, each delivered like a business offer, each assuming she would eventually cave. The bell rang long and loud, calling the town together while men laughed and slapped one another on the back. Maeve stayed home. The second time it rang was after she refused to sell the ice house to the North Ridge Lumber Syndicate, a deal the town Counsel had already promised on her behalf. The third time. It rang after she stood in the hall and accused 2 councilmen of skimming wages from the sawmill accounts. That night, her dock burned. No one was caught. No one apologized. And when the bell rang again before dawn, slow, deliberate, mocking Maeve made her choice. Now, with the bell destroyed, the town stood unsure what to do with her. You'll answer for this. A man finally spat. Maeve turned her eyes toward him. For breaking wood and metal? She asked. Or for not breaking myself? No one replied. Sheriff Pike rubbed a hand over his mouth. Go home, he said at last. This won't end here. I know, Maeve answered. She turned and walked away. By afternoon, the fog thinned enough for the White Pine Tavern to glow warm and amber against the gray. Inside its back room, the town council gathered around a scarred table slick with spilled whiskey and old resentment. Maeve stood outside, listening through warped planks. She humiliated us. One man growled. She thinks she's better than us, said another. She's dangerous, came a third voice. A woman alone with money and no fear. A fist struck the table. We ring the bell, she breaks it. Someone sneered. What's next? She breaks us? She already has, another muttered. Then a chair scraped. If you push her out, a low voice said, you'll have a riot by winter. The room went quiet. Jonah Kells rarely spoke in meetings because Jonah Kells rarely attended them. He was the river pilot, the man who guided log rafts and freight barges through the Blackwater's worst turns. He bore a scar across his cheek like a second mouth, pale and jagged, earned from a winter surge that killed 2 others. She broke a cymbal, Jonah continued. Not the law. And if you think ringing bells and burning docks makes you strong, you're fools. Since when do you defend her? Someone snapped. Jonah paused. Since I watched her rebuild what you were too afraid to touch. Silence swallowed the room. The meeting ended without resolution. Outside, Jonah found Maeve waiting. They'll come at you sideways now, he said. They always have, she replied. He studied her for a moment. You don't give them anything to hold. That's the point. Night fell thick and damp. Fog rolled in off the river, swallowing lantern light and bending sound until footsteps seemed to come from everywhere at once. Maeve locked the ice house and crossed the dock toward her cabin. Boards slick beneath her boots, halfway across. She heard laughter. 4 men stepped from the mist. Faces she knew. Smiles she didn't trust. One carried a coil of rope over his shoulder. You really did it, one said. Thought you were bluffing. Maeve stopped walking. You break things, another said, circling. Maybe you need breaking too. The river surged beneath the dock, low and restless. Maeve held her ground. Then the water exploded. Jonah Kells rose from the river like a ghost, soaked and silent, iron pike in his hand. Leave, he said. The men hesitated just long. Enough. Maeve said nothing as they retreated. Into the fog. She didn't thank Jonah. She didn't need to. But as she stepped into her cabin and barred the door, she felt it, the shift beneath her feet. The teasing was over. Fear had taken its place. And fear, in Willow Crossing, always demanded a reckoning. Morning arrived without light. The fog lay so thick over Willow Crossing that sound traveled before shape. And Maeve heard the river long before she saw it low, insistent. A voice that never slept. She knew something was wrong the moment she stepped onto the dock. The planks near the bend were crowded with people, their boots planted in a tight half circle, their voices hushed in the way they only ever were around death. Maeve slowed, breath steady, eyes fixed ahead. The river lapped against the posts with small, patient slaps. As though it had done nothing unusual at all, a body lay tangled in driftwood. The man's coat was half submerged. Dark wool pulled heavy by water. One boot had slipped off and floated a short distance away, bumping softly against the reeds. His face was turned toward the bank, pale and slack, eyes open in a way that suggested surprise rather than pain. Maeve recognized him immediately. Henry Boone. He had been laughing the night before. One of the four on the dock. The one with the rope. Sheriff Alden Pike stood closest, his hat pressed flat against his chest, his jaw set so tight it looked as though it might crack. He didn't look at Maeve as she approached, but she felt the attention shift, felt it sharpen. Someone crossed themselves. Someone else muttered her name. The bruise around Henry's neck was unmistakable. Dark, oval, the clear mark of pressure. Rope or hands, it hardly mattered. The river had finished what someone else began. Maeve did not speak. She did not step back. She stood where she was and let the fog cling to her coat, to her hair, to the quiet inside her chest. Jonah was on the opposite bank, arms folded, gaze fixed not on the body but on the current itself. He looked like a man listening to an old argument he'd heard too many times. Pike cleared his throat. "No one touches him," he said. "Not yet." The words were unnecessary. No one wanted to be closer than they already were. She threatened him, a voice said from behind Maeve. Everyone heard it. Maeve turned slowly. "I told him to leave me alone. That's not the same." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." The fog swallowed the space between statements. Pike finally looked at her. There was no accusation in his eyes, just fatigue. "I'm going to ask you to come with me," he said. Maeve nodded once. "I will." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Some had hoped for a spectacle. Some had hoped for flight. She gave them neither. They walked through the town in silence. The sound of boots on damp earth, of doors closing too carefully, of whispers trying and failing to stay low. Maeve noticed details she usually ignored, the way moss crept up porch posts, the way smoke from breakfast fires clung to the air instead of rising. Inside the jail, Pike closed the door and gestured toward the bench. "Know how this looks," he said. "Yes." "You know what they'll say?" "Yes." "And you know I don't think—" "You're a fool." Maeve met his eyes. "Then don't treat me like one." He exhaled slowly. "Where were you at dawn?" "In my cabin, asleep. Anyone see you?" "No." Pike nodded as though he'd expected that answer. He asked about the bell, about the men, about Jonah. Maeve answered plainly. She did not embellish. She did not defend herself beyond the truth. When Jonah was brought in, the mood shifted. The river pilot smelled of wet wool and iron. His hair was still damp. His boots tracking water across the floor. "Where were you at dawn?" Pike asked him. "In the river," Jonah replied without hesitation. A murmur rose outside the cell. "You expect me to believe that?" Pike asked. Jonah's mouth twitched. "The river doesn't ask permission." "What were you doing?" "Listening." Pike studied him for a long moment, then nodded once and dismissed him. By nightfall, nothing had been proven. Nothing had been resolved. And then the fire started. It wasn't loud. It didn't roar. It crept. Smoke curled through the jail like a living thing, slipping beneath doors, thick and bitter. Maeve woke coughing, eyes stinging, the taste of ash sharp on her tongue. Pike was already there, keys in hand, dragging her out as flames licked up the walls of the records room. The ledgers burned fast. Deeds curled and blackened. Names vanished. By the time the fire was out, the proof of anything, ownership, accusation, protection, had been reduced to damp ash. In the morning, Henry Boone's death had no paper trail, and Maeve Calder had no charges. What she had, instead, was a town that now understood how easily truth could be erased. The teasing didn't return. Something Calder replaced it. Men stopped meeting her eyes. Conversations cut short when she entered a room. The ice house saw fewer customers, not because they didn't need ice, but because they didn't want to be seen needing her. That was when the outsiders arrived. They came on horses too clean for river roads, coats too fine for the damp. 3 men at first, then more. They spoke politely. They smiled too easily. They asked questions about access, about contracts, about winter yields. Maeve said little. She watched. One evening, Jonah came to her cabin, blood dark on his sleeve. They signed something, he said. Council met in secret. Sold river access. They planned to take the ice house. Maeve didn't ask how he knew. She didn't ask who'd heard him. She stood, pulled on her coat, and reached for her knife. You can't fight them, Jonah said. Not like this. She looked at him. I don't have to. They walked to the river together, fog swirling around their legs. Maeve knelt, pressing her hand to the ice at the edge, feeling the tremor beneath. The river shifted. Impatient. Maeve closed her eyes. She had learned this place the way other people learn scripture, by repetition, by attention, by respect. Tomorrow, the town would learn it too. The river did not forget, and it never forgave lightly. Winter did not announce itself with snow. It came the way everything else did in Willow Crossing, quietly, insistently, with cold that crept into joints and thoughts alike. The river's edge filmed over in the mornings, thin as glass, cracking under the weight of birds. Fog thinned into a brittle clarity that made sound travel too far. Every axe strike from the hills rang like a warning. Maeve felt the change before she saw it. The ice house breathed differently. The stone held cold longer. The river ran tighter to its channel, shoulders squared, as if bracing. The men from outside began arriving before dawn. They did not ride like locals. Their horses were shod for roads, not muck. Their reins were clean, their hands gloved. They came with papers folded crisp, with smiles practiced in rooms that never smelled of rot. They stood on the bank and talked about access and rights and improvements, and they pretended not to see Maeve until it was convenient. Sheriff Pike walked with them once, then twice. He did not look comfortable doing it. He spoke little. When he passed Maeve on the street, he nodded as he always had, but there was a question in his eyes now, and a warning. The town did not gather like it used to. Meetings happened behind closed doors. Men who once jeered now avoided the ice house altogether. Women came at odd hours, coins clutched tight, eyes scanning the road. Maeve served them without comment. At night, Jonah came by when he could. He moved like a man who expected the dark to answer him back. They're measuring, he said one evening, dropping a rolled map onto her table. Soundings too. They've been marking the bend. Maeve unrolled the paper. It showed the river rendered in neat lines, the dock reduced to angles, the ice house a small square like it could be erased with a thumb. They don't understand it, Jonah went on. They think water behaves. Maeve's finger traced the map until it found the narrow throat upstream where the current pinched and the bank leaned in close. They're planning to push through at first light, she said. With wagons. Jonah nodded. Tomorrow. She sat back. Her face was calm, but the quiet inside her had sharpened. They'll need the dock. They've already decided it's theirs. She folded the map and set it aside. No, she said. They've decided to take it. The difference mattered. They went out before dawn, when frost made the ground sing underfoot. The river exhaled mist that smelled clean and metallic. Maeve carried a small satchel. Jonah carried nothing but a pry bar and the old iron spike he favored. They did not speak much. They did not need to. Maeve moved with certainty born of repetition, stepping where boards held, testing posts with the flat of her hand. At the bend, she knelt and pressed her palm to the ice, feeling the current's pulse beneath. She listened the way Jonah had said he did not for sound, but for intention. She opened the satchel and took out a wedge she'd shaped from oak weeks before, when the frost first threatened. She slid it into a seam at the base of the old timber brace, tapping until it seated. Jonah followed her lead, loosening bolts that had been replaced after the fire knew metal that sang when stressed. The river took note. They moved upstream next, to where last spring's flood had left a tangle of deadwood wedged against a rocky spur. Maeve had left it there deliberately. She drove a pin free with a careful blow and stepped back. Jonah met her eyes. "Once it goes," he said, "it won't stop. That's the idea." They were gone before the first light touched the hills. The wagons came with the sun. They rolled down the road, in a line 3 at first, then 2 more teams straining, wheels wrapped in iron. Men rode alongside, shouting instructions, confident in paper and numbers. On the bank, a few townsfolk watched, faces drawn, hands buried in sleeves. Maeve stood at the ice house door, arms folded, expression unreadable. A man dismounted and approached her, smiling as if they were old friends. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "we've got authorization to proceed." She did not move. "From whom?" He held up a document. "The council. Show me the seal." He hesitated, then laughed. "We're not here to argue." "No," Maeve said. "You're here to cross." The first wagon reached the dock. The board creaked. Then another sound joined it, a low groan from beneath. Like a throat clearing, Jonah stood on the far bank, hands at his sides. Maeve felt the shift before she saw it. The wedge did its work. The brace loosened. The ice, stressed by weight and morning warmth, spoke in a language she knew well. The river answered. The dock lurched. A wheel slipped, iron shrieking against wood. Men shouted. Horses screamed. Upstream, the deadwood broke free. It came down like a living thing, logs grinding, water rising, ice cracking in sheets. The current surged sideways, slamming into the weakened structure. The dock collapsed with a sound like a gunshot. One wagon tipped, then another. Men were thrown into the water, coats dragging them down. Jonah moved then, fast and sure, wading into the shallows with the iron spike, hooking belts, hauling bodies toward the bank. Maeve did not move until the last horse was clear. The river took no lives. It took property. It took certainty. By noon, the bank was a mess of splintered wood and soaked paper. The men from outside stood shivering, faces gray, confidence leached out by cold water and humiliation. Sheriff Pike arrived late, breath steaming, eyes sweeping the damage. He looked at Maeve. She met his gaze. "You planned this," he said quietly. "I planned for the river to behave like itself," she replied. He glanced at Jonah, who was wringing water from his sleeves. "Anyone hurt?" "Cold," Jonah said. "Nothing worse." Pike nodded. He turned back to the men with papers. "You're done here," he said. "Pack up?" They protested. They waved documents. Pike listened, then shook his head. "You don't have a dock. You don't have access. And until you do, you don't have authority." They left by dusk, wagons lighter, tempers heavier. The town was silent that night. Not the tense quiet of waiting, but the exhausted quiet that follows a storm. Fires burned low. Doors stayed shut. The river ran clear, its anger spent. Maeve sat on her cabin steps and watched the moon rise. Jonah joined her after a while, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You could have lost everything," he said. "I already did," she replied. "Once." He was quiet for a long moment. "They'll try again." "Maybe," Maeve said, "but they'll think harder." Sheriff Pike came the next day alone. He took off his hat and held it in both hands. "They want me to press charges," he said. "Sabotage." Maeve waited. "I won't," he continued. "Not without bodies. Not without proof. And there isn't any." She studied him. "Why tell me?" He met her eyes. "Because this town has been leaning on fear for too long. And because you showed them another way." "Did I?" "You showed them the river," Pike said. "And themselves." He left without another word. Winter deepened. Ice thickened. Maeve cut blocks and stored them, her movements efficient, unhurried. People came back, slowly at first, then more often. They paid fair. They spoke carefully. Some apologized without words. One evening, Jonah brought her the broken watch she kept wrapped in cloth. "It ticks when the ice shifts," he said. "I thought you'd want to hear it." She held it to her ear and smiled, just a little. Outside, the river flowed on, keeping its accounts, waiting. Spring arrived the way forgiveness sometimes did, without announcement, without ceremony, and not all at once. The ice along the river loosened its grip and thinned, singing cracks that echoed at dawn. Fog still came and went, but it no longer pressed so hard against the town. Water ran clearer, faster, as if something long held had finally been released. Maeve noticed it first in the way. People walked out. They no longer hurried past the ice house with their heads down. They no longer pretended not to see her. Some nodded. A few stopped to speak about weather or river height, careful and awkward, like people relearning a language they had almost forgotten. The teasing never returned. What replaced it wasn't admiration or affection. It was something steadier. Acknowledgement. The council dissolved quietly. No announcement was made. One man moved east to live with a brother. Another sold his house and left before summer. Their seats remained empty, the table in the hall gathering dust. When decisions needed making, they were made openly now, in daylight. With voices that shook a little from disuse, Sheriff Alden Pike handed in his badge. The morning the last ice broke free downstream, Maeve was loading blocks when he came by. Hat in hand, coat neatly brushed as though for church. "I've done what I can," he said. She leaned against a post, watching meltwater trickle into the river. "You did more than most." He smiled faintly. "That's not saying much." Jonah stood a few paces away, checking ropes, pretending not to listen. "They'll send someone else," Pike went on. "A younger man. Cleaner reputation." Maeve shrugged. "Let him learn the river." Pike laughed softly at that. He hesitated, then said, "You changed this place." "I didn't mean to," Maeve replied. "I know," he said. And that, somehow, meant more. He left town that afternoon, walking instead of riding, boots steady on the road, as though he wanted to feel the distance. Life settled. The ice house filled and emptied in its familiar rhythm. Jonah took on more river work as traffic returned honest work. Smaller loads, fewer men trying to force the water to obey paper promises. He came by most evenings, sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit. They did not speak about what they were to each other. There was no need. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the water copper bright, Maeve stood at the edge of the rebuilt dock, watching children throw stones into the shallows. Their laughter carried cleanly across the water. Jonah joined her, hands shoved into his pockets. "They're rebuilding the church," he said. Maeve nodded. "I know, Nobel." She smiled, not wide, not showy, but real. "Good." He studied her for a moment. "Do you ever regret it?" She considered the question honestly. Thought of the night fog, the rope biting into her palms, the sound of wood giving way. "No," she said. "I regret waiting." Jonah nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. The river moved on, unconcerned with memory or meaning. But the town had learned something in its presence. Men stopped trying to test Maeve, not because she had frightened them. though she had, but because they had finally understood. She was not a challenge to be won or broken. She was a fact. Like the river. One afternoon, a young man came to the ice house with his hat twisting nervously in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "my wife's sick. We need ice." "I don't have." Maeve cut him off gently. "Take what you need." He stared. "I'll pay you back." "I know," she said. Word spread not as charity, but as trust. That summer, the river flooded again, as it always did. But the town was ready. Docks had been set higher. Channels cleared. People worked together without waiting for permission. Maeve stood in the rain beside Jonah, watching water rise and fall. "They won't forget," Jonah said. "No," Maeve agreed. "But they'll remember differently." When autumn came, leaves burned gold along the banks. Fog returned, but lighter now, drifting instead of pressing. Maeve found herself laughing once quietly. Unexpectedly, when Jonah dropped a crate into the water and cursed with genuine surprise. He stared at her like he'd seen something rare. "You can laugh," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Don't spread it around." He smiled. They never married. They never needed to explain why. They built something steadier than ceremony, shared work, shared silence, shared understanding of a place that demanded respect. On the anniversary of the Bell's fall, Maeve walked through town at dawn. The street was clean. Grass grew between stones where the bronze had struck and broken. She stopped, closed her eyes, and listened. No ringing. Just the river. She breathed in damp pine and water and the faint smoke of breakfast fires. She felt the solid weight of the ground beneath her boots. Maeve Calder did not look down. She never had. And because of that, Willow Crossing learned how to stand.